Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And as you mentioned, yes, my father is from Heber Springs, and he's sitting right here. So if you don't like what you hear tonight, you can blame him. I'm very happy to be here. It really is. It's an honor. This is actually the second time I've been able to address folks at a presidential center/library. I was recently at the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor, which is a little bit smaller than this. If you've never been there before, but it's actually kind of it's fitting too to be doing this with the Clinton School and here at the Presidential Center, because I actually have a connection to the administration in my career that I never get to talk about when I do book talks, but I'll tell you about it tonight. Sort of in the 1990s, when President Clinton and Vice President Gore were doing their Reinventing Government initiative, there was this wonderfully sexy topic of procurement reform that they took on, which was all about, helping the government buy goods and services more efficiently and running it more like a business. And this was real stuff, and it actually had practical impact and import in Washington. As it turns out, when I was starting out my journalism career and moved to Washington to be a magazine writer, my beat was information technology procurement. Which, again, fascinating topic, but really owed its entire existence to this initiative that had been started in the Clinton administration. I came in the final 2 days of the administration before President Bush was inaugurated, so I covered Clinton for 2 days and Bush for 8 years. I don't know who got the better bargain, I don't know. But it did sort of create this, wonderful, almost this market for information technology in Washington, D.C., and suddenly companies were interacting with agencies in ways that they couldn't before, and sort of these barriers were coming down, and this was all really done in the name of efficiency, but it also ended up bringing government and the private sector a lot closer together in the space of information technology. And as you'll see as I talk about the book, you're going to see that that's kind of a theme. And it kind of planted me at the age of 24 right in the middle of this sort of world for which I had no real training. I was not a technologist by background. My first job in journalism as a junior researcher at a magazine in Washington was in 1999, and I was a recent college graduate. And they said, we really want somebody who's fresh out of college because you know how to use the internet. And we think it has great potential as a research tool, like an encyclopedia or something. I can remember going to work every day and having multiple search engines and going out and searching for keywords in the news and printing out the paper and then storing it in archives. So we were really at sort of the tipping point and the cutting edge of technology transforming that business as well in media. But it was because of this job that I had covering technology that for me, everything sort of changed on 9/11. And that seems like a bit of a cliche to say that now, but for me professionally, it really was this pivot point. I'm writing about technology, how the Defense Department's using computers, how civilian agencies are buying and selling information technology and the like. And on 9/11, every journalist in Washington basically had to just stop whatever they were doing and figure out how what you wrote about intersects with what is just happening and unfolding. So if you wrote about the military, it was obvious you were going to be covering a deployment very soon. If you wrote about the aviation industry, you're going to be writing about how that industry was affected by this. But it wasn't immediately obvious how technology intersected with this. But fairly quickly, you'll probably remember after the 9/11 attacks, this meme started to develop of the government did not connect the dots about 9/11. That the FBI had information on the terrorists who were inside the United States. The CIA had been monitoring those terrorists but did not tell the FBI when they arrived. You all remember the story of Zacarias Moussaoui, sometimes called the 20th hijacker, and how the FBI literally up until September 10th was struggling to get a warrant to search his computer to find out what he might know about whatever terrorists he was connected to. Of course, at the time, we didn't know how much he knew. Into this space of this problem of not being able to connect the dots, technology companies in 2001 came rushing. And everybody had a new idea on how they were going to build a computer system or use a piece of software or an algorithm that was going to solve this problem for the government and finally merge all those dots and paint the picture of what we did not know and effectively be able to see the future. So that is kind of where I was sitting on 9/11, and that technology beat, created by procurement reform, becomes national security. And it's really been sort of an amazing ride for the past 10 years ever since. And I got into this business because I wanted to tell stories. And there is no shortage of stories to tell in this area. So I will tell you the story of my book, The Watchers. As I started exploring this whole meme, if you will, this government failing to connect the dots, what surprised me was to learn that 9/11 was not the first moment when the government realized that they had a problem knowing what they knew. That actually you could go back much, much further, really to the emergence of suicidal religious terrorism against the United States itself to find this theme playing out. And that's where I begin the book. It's actually on October 23rd, 1983. The sun rose over the Beirut airport where about 300 to 400 US Marines were stationed as part of an international peacekeeping force. They'd been there for many months. These were actually a new team that had come in to replace some Marines who had been there for months before them. They were there as a peacekeeping force in the Lebanese civil war, which was really raging out of control at that time. Because they were peacekeepers, they were largely unarmed. Their base was largely unguarded. We did not want to have a military presence, per se. And as the sun rose and many of the men were asleep in their bunks or in a large barracks building at the airport complex, a man driving a yellow Mercedes-Benz truck laden with explosives plowed through the gate and steered his truck toward the guard outpost of the main barracks building and drove straight into the lobby and detonated it. The explosion was actually so powerful that it lifted the building up out of its foundations into the sky, and it actually kind of imploded and cavitated in on itself. 240 Marines died in that attack. Most of them were asleep at the time. And this was really the first instance that we had ever seen in the United States of religiously motivated suicidal terrorism. And this was, if you were there and you remember it, as I'm sure many people do, I mean, it was sort of a revelation. It was like, where did this come from? And it seemed to come from nowhere. Well, that morning, the phones start ringing off the hook in Washington. The Situation Room is alerted to this. And they call the Deputy National Security Advisor, who is basically on duty manning the post that night while the national security is away with President Reagan in Augusta, Georgia. And they inform him what happened and say, you need to get down to the White House right away. That man was a guy named John Poindexter, who had a storied career in the Navy. He was an admiral at the time. He had graduated first in his class from the U.S. Naval Academy. Really just an extraordinary, one of these rare stories of somebody who has innate genius and brilliance, is also an extreme bureaucratic manager, and just manages to succeed by sort of force of sheer will and personality in Washington. He had only been the Deputy National Security Advisor for a brief period, but he gets called down to come manage this crisis. And it really kind of falls to him as the operations guy, if you like, on the NSC staff, to start piecing together the pieces of the puzzle. What happened? How did we not know this? How do we have 241 dead Marines and nobody can explain where this came from? And what he starts to learn is he kind of goes through all the various agencies and kind of runs the traps and figures out what everyone knows. And as a government investigation is going on at the same time, finds that we actually did know quite a bit about threats in Beirut against the U.S. Marines there. In fact, there had been a bombing of the U.S. Embassy only 6 months before, in which much of the CIA station in Beirut was wiped out. It was a devastating attack as well. And what he finds is that the FBI had investigated the earlier bombing. They had found significant signatures in the bomb-making apparatus itself that implied that there was a sophisticated terrorist group working in Beirut, probably targeting American targets of interest. We had over 100 warnings about car bombs that were collected by the intelligence community. And importantly, the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is the government's eavesdropping apparatus, had actually intercepted, although it had not communicated in time, a message suggesting that Hezbollah or agents and proxies of Iran were planning a spectacular attack against U.S. interests in Beirut. Well, there really was only one place to plan a spectacular attack against U.S. interests in Beirut. It was the airport. None of this information was ever communicated to the commanders on the ground. No security measures were taken to improve the situation at the base. They were not allowed to start carrying guns, loaded rifles. So Poindexter looked at this and he really realized that the government had failed to connect the dots about this. And being the great believer that he was in the power of systems and of technology, this was a guy who had actually been a part of Defense Secretary McNamara's team of the so-called whiz kids who had been brought into the Pentagon in the 1960s to help solve the biggest national security challenges of the day using their engineering and technological acumen. Poindexter believed there is a systematic way to solve this problem. We need to start using technology to harness together the CIA, the FBI, the military, get them to start sharing information. He'd actually been brought to the White House to do just that, provide a technological upgrade to the Situation Room, installing modern telecommunications equipment and teleconferencing systems, things that it's shocking to think about today, but the Situation Room simply didn't have in the 1980s. It was really just a technological backwater. So all of this work sort of falls to him, and what I kind of realized in researching this is that if you trace back even to the roots of counterterrorism in the United States, John Poindexter is sort of like this Godfather figure. He sort of ignites this whole bureaucratic momentum around this problem. And the way these things often work is that it takes somebody sitting at a very high level, in this case the White House, applying a lot of pressure in a sustained way to keep it going. And the key word being sustained. Well, for those of you who are familiar with Poindexter's claim to fame, you will know that his career flamed out rather spectacularly in 1986 when he was implicated as one of the lead conspirators in the Iran-Contra affair. Which was the most significant at the time political scandal to hit the White House since Watergate. The threat of impeachment against President Reagan was very real. Poindexter famously testified before Congress that the president knew nothing about this scheme, and that famously he said, "The buck stops here with me." A lot of people question whether he was telling the truth in that testimony, because had the buck not stopped there with him and actually been passed on to the president, you might have seen impeachment proceedings beginning against Reagan. So Poindexter is out of government by this point. And with him, this whole energy kind of dissipates as he leaves. This energy around, we have to do better about counterterrorism. We have to integrate all of the powers and the capabilities of the national security apparatus, which is growing all the time in the Cold War, remember. The government becomes very, very good at using satellites and eavesdropping equipment to collect images and electronic transmissions and storing this, but not doing a great job at analyzing it. Well, Poindexter sort of spends his time in exile doing what you do in Washington after you leave government. You go become a contractor. And does some fairly low-level work, very quietly, sometimes on contract for the Defense Department, still pursuing this idea about how can we use this technology to solve this great problem. And he's this passionate believer in this, and he kind of refuses to let it go. And then one day, he's driving to work on September 11th, 2001, and he gets a phone call. And it's his wife. And she says, "You have to turn on the radio right now." And he gets the report that planes have hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. His first initial fear goes to his son, who at the time had actually been assigned to the Chief of Naval Operations Office and was working out of the Pentagon. And it took them a few minutes to realize that he was not in the building and that he was safe. And then immediately, his mind flashes back after he knows his son is safe to what did we know about this event and why didn't we figure it out? Why didn't we know sooner? So he goes back to his office and pretty much works throughout the night thinking about what do we do now. And it really sort of says something about sort of the way he thinks, that someone like a John Poindexter who you would think had sort of been beaten down and out for good, now is sitting there on September 11th thinking, well, how can I help? What do we need to do to apply ourselves to this problem? On September 12th, he gets in touch with a friend of his, and they start talking about a program that they had conceived of in years past and that they had had a loose working title around called Total Information Awareness. And it was this idea of, again, how can we use the power of technology to harness all this data and really kind of know what we don't know and make theories about where future events are unfolding and how can we allocate our resources. Now, of course, it has this tremendous motivation to do it quickly. Now they have a reason to do it. And they get in touch with friends of theirs in the Defense Department and basically pitch this idea to an agency called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. DARPA is famous for developing the internet. They invented stealth technology. It is sort of the place in the Defense Department where all of the big thinking, the huge problems, almost where science fiction meets reality goes on. And they say, what we need to do is develop a program that says, okay, we have this pool of information about what the government knows, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. We've known about those problems for decades. But we're living in a world in which now people are attacking us as they are moving among us. They are out there renting cars, buying airplane tickets, making purchases, making phone calls, sending emails, staying in hotels, joining gyms, any number of the things that the 9/11 hijackers did. And when they do that, they're leaving a digital footprint. They're leaving a trace of where they went and possibly what they were planning. Could we get that information as well, put it together with the government information, and have a fuller picture of where the next attack might be? Okay, well, it seems logical that you can do that, but the problem is you don't know who those hijackers are. You don't know where they are. They could be anyone. You're looking for a needle in a haystack, or as people in this community like to say, a needle in a pile of needles. Everyone looks the same based on their data. So Poindexter's sort of technological solution to that was, fine, just collect all the data. Total information awareness, collect it all. It was not lost on him what a potentially calamitous proposal this would be if it ever got out publicly. But he really wanted to challenge people in the government and even ultimately in public policy to start thinking differently about privacy, to start thinking differently about the state of security when the attacks are coming from within and from among you. He's a scientist, right? He's not a PR guy. So you start off with the name Total Information Awareness. It might be a little creepy, might make people a little unsettled, but to him it's very definitive. It says accurately what you're trying to do. They get this program up and running at DARPA. They develop a logo for the office, which if you've ever seen it, it's kind of hard to find now, but there's a picture of it in the book. It is a picture of, if you have a dollar bill and you look on the back and you see the Great Seal of the United States with the pyramid and the all-seeing eye. Well, they took that, and there's a beam of light coming off of the eye over a picture of the globe. And it says Total Information or Information Awareness Office, which is where it was located. And in Latin scroll around the edge of it, it says, knowledge is power. Again, to him, he thought it was pretty clever, pretty neat. You know, they kind of designed it on a whim. It's the Great Seal of the United States. What's not to love about that? Well, you know, there's the association with the Freemasons and the fact that, like, why is this eye looking at the world? And the Latin scroll, well, you get the idea. They kind of quietly launched this project. It was not classified, which is sort of hard to believe now, knowing all that we know about how the government does this kind of work. But this was a public research project, and it was a research project. They weren't actively building anything. They were sort of soliciting ideas. I was actually one of the first reporters that they invited in at the time, because remember, I'm like the guy writing about technology in the bowels of the government, and they're like, oh, technology reporter, why don't you come in and see this thing that we're building? And I have to say that at the time, nothing about it struck me as novel, other than the logo and the fact that John Poindexter was attached. And the reason for that is that there were dozens of companies proposing to do a variation on the same thing. They weren't as blatant about it. They obviously weren't working under the auspices of the Defense Department program. But we're talking companies you've heard of, software companies, tech companies, many of whom had lost their shirts in Silicon Valley in the dot-com bust and now needed to recoup a lot of those losses. And hey, what better way to do it than by selling to this vast national security apparatus that is starting up? What struck me as unique about Total Information Awareness was that Poindexter, anticipating the potential outrage that this could cause over privacy when you're scooping up everyone's information because you might be a terrorist or you might be a terrorist, how do we know, was that he had this technological solution for how you would protect privacy. He wanted to use advanced data encryption, and the idea here would be that all of the information that this system collects is anonymized. There are no names. Everyone is simply assigned a code, or all the points of references, the locations, the people, the events, are assigned codes. And the computer can put these pieces together and start forming a potential picture of what might be happening. But Poindexter's idea was that the government can't actually get the authority to unlock the codes and see who's underneath it unless a judge says it's okay. So a fairly sophisticated regime that very much follows how we do things like wiretapping and intelligence surveillance. That was the one thing that I never heard any of those companies talking about. They didn't even want to talk about privacy. You know, it was like, oh, well, the privacy issues. It was almost just this bucket of things that we'll get to. He was talking about baking it in from the beginning. That struck me as novel and as important. So I wanted to start writing about this. But quickly found that I was writing about a program that was getting a lot more press than my small magazine at the time could give it. The New York Times wrote a story about TIA. And Bill Sapphire, in a now pretty famous column, absolutely eviscerated this program. I believe the quote was, the ring-knocking master of deceit from Iran-Contra is back with a scheme even more outlandish than the last. This program was basically cooked. It was done. It hung on for about another year or so. There were congressional hearings. Poindexter had to give reports to Congress. People wanted to know, what are you doing over there? Mind you, none of this was classified, but nobody really thought to look. whatever energies and ideas that they were developing pretty much were dead from the outset. Interestingly, the thing that finally finished the program off was Congress got wind of another project that Poindexter had been kicking around to use what are called futures markets to try and predict terrorist attacks. The idea here was you get a bunch of experts together and they all sort of effectively place bets on where the next attack is likely to be, who's likely to be the perpetrator. The ironic thing about that is that of all of the proposals that he'd been looking at, that was the one that got the most serious consideration from social scientists, technologists, and economists who said, yeah, it might actually work. If you're following the election right now and you're going to the site InTrade, where every day people are making predictions on who's up and who's down, that's a futures market. Okay? We use these things to predict NCAA brackets and Oscar winners. There's a lot of science around that it might work. But again, it's underneath this banner of total information awareness. So that ended up being sort of the final straw, and Poindexter was pushed out. I actually made his acquaintance after that. I had tried to contact him and write about him and interview him all this time that he was in. And I came to find out that Don Rumsfeld had personally put a gag order on him and said, you're not to talk to any journalists, just stay away from the press until we get this thing figured out. But I continued to be interested in the program, and my job was to understand tech. I wasn't learning about policy. It was what's the technology, what's the big idea, and why is this special? About a year or so after he was out of government, it happened that we were both at a conference, a very small conference in Syracuse together. And he took the opportunity to come up and introduce himself. He knew what I looked like, and this was in the days before like Facebook and major Google images, so I'm not sure how he knew who I was, but it's part of the mystery, right? And he comes up and he taps me on the shoulder, and I hear this voice behind me say, Shane Harris, and I turn around and it's John Poindexter. And mind you, I'd seen maybe 2 pictures of him taken since his Iran-Contra days, but it was pretty clearly him. And I'm sort of imagining, that I'm going to be meeting like the evil Bond genius for the first time, and he's going to have like a monocle and stroking a cat and all the rest. There's really, now you're face to face with it. And it was actually a completely underwhelming experience because he was very quiet, he was very soft-spoken, he was very polite. And he said, I really just wanted to come up and say, I'm sorry I couldn't talk to you, I couldn't grant your interview requests. I read everything that you wrote. I didn't like all of it. But what I did appreciate was that you were trying to understand what we were doing. You were trying to be fair about it, really kind of get to the heart of it. And I said, well, if you're willing, would you want to sit down and talk about that at some point? Possibly for a profile. And he said, well, I'll seriously consider it. And he seriously considers everything. He doesn't do anything without seriously considering it. And he called me about a week later and he said, I'll meet with you on one condition, and that is that you have to come out to my house and do these interviews. We'll do 1 to 2 a week, each for 2 hours. It'll all be on the record and we'll record everything. Those are my terms. Now, it's been said that John Poindexter, that one of his great failures as the National Security Advisor was that he was not really savvy about how journalists operate. And I knew this was true then, because anybody who thinks that that is an onerous request for a journalist, a personal invitation to come hang out in the home of the most notorious political figure of the past quarter century. My response, of course, was like, I'll really have to check my calendar. I can fit you in. I don't think that he even grasped, from my perspective, sort of how extraordinary this actually was for a journalist. So that begat sort of this, series of interviews that ultimately was about 14 for the book and 4 for a magazine story. So about 18 sit-downs with John Poindexter, which was, as a whole, you could almost write a book about that. It was sort of like Tuesdays with Maury, but, a weird twist on it. But we stayed in touch after he left government, and I continued sort of, following these stories of technology and intelligence, and the beat was sort of getting quiet for a little while. It kind of felt like maybe things had peaked out, and this whole issue of data mining was maybe it was going to stay, maybe it was going to go away. And then December 2005, everything changed. That was the time that the New York Times ran a front page story that ultimately won the Pulitzer, that to my mind stands as one of the most just breathtaking feats of investigative journalism I've certainly seen in my career. It was a front page story about how, for the previous 4 years, completely in secret and under direct authority of the president, the National Security Agency had been running a systematic campaign of warrantless wiretapping and surveillance of people inside the United States, apparently on the predication that they had a connection to terrorism, whatever that might be. And importantly, had been bypassing a special court that was set up in the 1970s specifically to prohibit this kind of surveillance in the United States without oversight from a court. This was a blockbuster. This is a huge story. Curiously, I know from some of the people who were involved in that, the New York Times actually, I think, thought that it wasn't going to be the barn burner that it was, because there was some sense that maybe this was just going to be yet another story about government overreach and the war on terror and homeland security. Well, we all know that it stopped Washington in its tracks, basically. And I think the reason for that is that this was such a clear violation of a law that was set up to prevent exactly what was happening. My take on this, after having studied it for many years, is that the program was almost certainly illegal, that Congress was not properly notified, and that much of what we're seeing in surveillance today actually is not a lot different from what the NSA was doing for 4 years, just now it's technically illegal, and it's not as secret as it once was. But being a reporter at the time, I sort of jumped onto this story, and first started talking to a lot of the contacts that I had within government and in that market of people who do business with the government, and started talking to sources of mine in the telecom industry, the phone companies, basically, who do huge amounts of business with the government, billions of dollars every year. And what I started finding as I poked around was that, yes, they'd read the story, some of these telecom executives, and well, we think there might be a little more to it than wiretapping, than monitoring individuals. And in particular, there were some sources that informed me that not long after 9/11, they had been visited by government agents, which is never, a pleasant experience. And the request was made very quickly after the attacks that we want to get access to call detail records, CDRs. Now, if you don't work in the telecom business, you don't know what a CDR is. But if you own a phone, you do know what it is. It looks like your phone bill. It's the list that you get every month, or however often you get it, showing who you called, what the number was, the duration of the call, et cetera. Basically, what will often be referred to as the metadata of your call history, your logs. It's basically your footprints that you've been leaving in the telecom space. Well, it didn't take long for a lot of these executives and these people at the phone companies to figure out why the government might access to that. You would only need massive access to call detail records if you wanted to track communications inside the United States. And if you had a phone number, it stands to reason that you could put that number into the system and find out who that person had been in contact with, who they've been talking to. Phone numbers and metadata, it turns out, are a great way of tracking people and understanding their associations, and actually are sometimes more revealing than the content of the call itself. I mean, if we're planning a terrorist attack, we're probably not going to be saying, hey, Bob, are you ready to plant the bomb tomorrow? There's going to be some coded language. We're probably going to try and use go-betweens. We're probably not going to talk for that long. Has anybody ever seen The Wire? You guys ever watch the show The Wire, where the drug dealers start buying the phones and throwing them away, right? Every 2 hours of use. Well, these are things that any sort of sophisticated criminal is going to do to try and evade detection. So what's the NSA's response to that? Get all the data, gather it all up so we can look at it and have it available to us. Well, this started sounding very, very familiar. Who else do I know who was talking about we need to get large access to private data stores to try and figure out who the guilty people are, separate them from the innocent, use their transaction patterns, use their digital footprints, et cetera. This was effectively total information awareness, but sort of limited to phone data, which is a huge data store, let's remind ourselves. And it struck me that, Poindexter might actually have some insights into something like this and how this came to pass. And to his credit, he did not reveal what I think he knew, because what happened was classified, but through other sources and through reporting, what I found out was that when Poindexter was pushed out of government and total information awareness was shut down, it was shut down in name only. And some of his former associates, working with staff on the Hill, essentially brokered an agreement whereby that program was broken up into component parts, into different pieces, and it was moved underneath the management of the National Security Agency. The very same agency that had been doing this broad-scale, massive data mining effectively absorbs all of John Poindexter's ideas, his technology, his contacts. Interestingly, the one piece that they did not take over was the research that he was doing into how to protect individual privacy and encryption. They didn't want that. So I continue reporting on this story and find that, in effect what you have here is NSA, under dubious legal arrangements, collecting unprecedented amounts of information on Americans. They also deviated from Poindexter in another important way. Poindexter's idea always was, look, you can't just swallow the ocean of data and go fishing around. You have to have some idea what you're looking for. So we should start developing what he used to call templates. What kinds of activity are we looking for? What sort of patterns might we try and imagine beforehand? Very, very difficult to do, possibly a fool's errand, but this was the idea. It was not to simply swallow the whole ocean and try and digest it, make sense of it. That's apparently exactly, though, what NSA wanted to do. They became very enamored of this idea of collecting more and more and more information, and now that you've got all this data, how do we make sense of it all at once? And the focus really became much more on collecting and not making sense of it. And we should step back from this, and it kind of seems absurd that you would go that route. But you have to remember that these are technologists. They have a view on how technology can be used to answer questions and solve problems. And within the NSA, the answer to the problem of how do we predict terrorism was try and look at all the data at once. Try and see the patterns in it and make connections. Very, very difficult to do. And where this sort of puts us is kind of where we are now, which is that the government has become extraordinarily good at collecting dots and is still very, very bad at connecting them. This idea of leaving no stone unturned has ended up with just piles and piles of stones, and we don't know where to begin. The sort of key moment that we know about publicly that I think really illustrates this well happens on December 25th, 2009. When a young Nigerian man named Farouk Abdulmutallab gets on a plane in Europe bound for Detroit with a homemade bomb strapped into his underwear and tries to detonate it over the United States. And obviously it does not succeed. As soon as that happened, within hours we're talking, immediately, just like in 1983, the White House starts spinning up, what do we know about this guy? When did we know it? What happened and why did we miss it? And the parallels are just eerie to me. We find out that we actually knew a lot about Farouk Abdulmutallab. We knew, for instance, that his father had come into a U.S. embassy in Abuja some months before and said, I have a fear that my son has gone to Yemen and is associating with radicals. His name was then entered into a database that is the first stop where names go before you're put on a terrorist watch list or a no-fly list. We actually had intercepted chatter from known terrorists in Yemen talking or alluding in coded reference to somebody who might be a Nigerian operative, and of course put that together with the father going in and talking about his son going to Yemen. These pieces kind of start to add up a little bit. Could they have led you to the gate as Farouk Abdulmutallab is getting on that airplane with the bomb in his underpants? I don't know. But the point is that nobody knew that information existed because it all went into a central repository at a place called the National Counterterrorism Center, not far outside of Washington, D.C., where literally thousands of these kinds of leads are coming in every single day. The analysts who sit in that center have multiple computer stations on their desktop so that they can get access to all of the various dozens of data streams that are pouring in information. It's like drinking from a fire hose. And when I interviewed people about this, we look at this and we say, well, why don't you guys have, Google? Why don't you have alerts being set up that tell you, where to look? And they don't even have that. The technology is actually primitive in many ways compared to what we would assume is available to all of us as users of the internet. And let's not forget also that this data is unstructured. It's emails, it's reports, it's multiple agencies, it's pictures, it's moving image, it's everything is all coming in there, and they're literally drowning in it. And you're kind of back at the same point where you don't know what you know because you'll never have time to look at it. In 1983, we didn't know what we knew because we didn't have the capability to draw all these pieces together. Now, we have a system that can talk to it. The agencies can talk to each other, but it's just overwhelmed in data. This is no way to fight terrorism. This is no way to solve problems. I don't think it's the idea that John Poindexter had in mind either when he proposed this arguably very radical and potentially very dangerous program of total information awareness. But we have effectively kind of ended up at this point where we have total information and very little awareness. So you sort of have 2 out of 3. The implications for this are pretty obvious to me. One is that you overlook the actual terrorists, right? The Abdulmutallabs, who are a real threat, slip through the system. And of course, the other is that you've now built this system that is great at collecting information on everyone. Well, what happens if they do decide to turn their sights on an individual? One thing the government's very, very good at since 9/11 is if they have a name, if they have a phone number, if they have a lead, they can find everything there is to know about that individual. That's a very different proposition than starting in the dark and trying to find out who the bad guy is in this vast ocean of potential bad guys. So we've created this system that is not really very good at preventing terrorism, but is potentially very good at spying on us, which seems to me really a sort of supreme irony in that we've really gotten it backwards. That is absolutely not what people were setting out to do 10 years ago. I don't spend a lot of time in the book talking about sort of the political stances on this and in the policy positions people take, because I really wanted to write about what was motivating these people to do what they did. But regardless of whether people were liberal or conservative, there was one point when I did the research for this over the years that everyone agreed on. And that was that if there were another 9/11 style event, an act of terrorism of that magnitude, all these questions about balancing security with liberty, about how far should we go in an age of digital privacy, all of these discussions become academic and basically go out the window. And the government goes into supreme collection mode and being very indiscriminate, almost collect first and ask questions later. Everyone I talk to also wants to avoid that happening. And I think that the way you get to avoiding that is by having honest discussions about what is the government collecting, what is it doing with it, why does it need the information. We're all adults, we can handle this. But the tendency has been to keep this all very secret and to sort of to prize the information almost as an asset and not let anybody know what you're doing. It's understandable you wouldn't want anyone to know what you're doing when it's probably illegal, as it was in the first years of the Bush administration, but it is all effectively legal now. Much of this work is actually done now under a modified surveillance law that was put in place in the late 70s. And I think with it, sort of the concern about what they're doing almost seems to have dissipated somehow because it's legal. But I don't think that we should be surprised if that very undesirable outcome occurs where there is another act of terrorism. We should not be surprised when the government reverts to all these bad tendencies. And in fact, history tells us, it's told us for 25 years, that that is exactly what the government knows how to do best. They will collect information, and they will ask questions later, and it will be done largely in the name of protecting us, as it was just after 9/11, but we will not really be any smarter and any more advanced in this quest to keep us safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane, for that. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, sir. 1 second. Yeah, it's fine.
Well, one question I had is, how much do you think the privacy around the program hampered them from actually doing something like what he wanted to have happen, which is actually make it effective?
We said the privacy around the program?
Right. Not the privacy of the personal protection that he was talking about, but more the privacy of, oh, we have this program, we can't let you see this program.
Yeah.
How much of that do you think actually hampered them?
I think it hampered them. I think it hampered total information awareness quite a bit. I mean, they were trying to sort of, advance this cause of security and privacy at the same time, which seems kind of implausible in retrospect. But in order to do that, you have to talk about it, right? You have to sort of make it public. When it ultimately became public in a big way, it was not the reception that they were hoping for, obviously. And the reaction by the Pentagon was to put it under wraps, to sort of keep it quiet. And I think that that ultimately killed any chance for a realistic, rational discussion around it. Similar to what happened with the NSA program. I mean, obviously they're kept secret for different reasons, but you can't have a full discussion about this and weigh the policy merits of it when, a handful of people know about it. Jane Harman, who was on the Intelligence Committee after the NSA program was revealed, NSA tried to say that they had briefed members of Congress and the intelligence communities about this, and she had a famous quote where she came out and she said, "A PowerPoint briefing does not constitute total disclosure," implying that basically they were told the bare minimum of information because it was national security. Go ahead,
Yes,
follow
sir.
up.
One,
Sure, go ahead.
Awareness.
Or Facebook. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is another one of the ironies is that social networking sites and just, Google itself probably know more about us, right, than the government does, and much of that information we gave over voluntarily. This is what I mean when I say when the definition of privacy has changed. People's expectations of privacy has changed. I think privacy is effectively dead. Now the question is whether you have a right to remain anonymous on the internet, which is going to be the next big policy debate. But I think it also is sort of is not lost on people in government, right? That Google has this power. I mean, Google is currently engaged in relationships with the NSA to share information about cyber breaches on its network, people having email data stolen and trying to use that information to track cyber espionage and other things like this. Google is a resource for the government. AT&T was a resource for the government. That's why they gave them all their data. So that connection has only grown stronger, frankly, in time, and it is not lost on anybody in the intelligence community how powerful they are, those companies.
yes, sir. 1 second.
How much of what you're talking about falls under the Patriot Act?
Patriot Act actually, if you'd asked me that question a year ago, I might have said not as much as you might think. Now what we find is that there is apparently within the Patriot Act a secret interpretation of a provision of the Patriot Act that has effectively created a Patriot Act within the Patriot Act. And it has become clearer, although it is still pretty murky in recent months as the reporting on this has come out, that the Patriot Act probably does inform and guide how the government views its authority to collect information and what they can do with it. So, the answer to that is probably the Patriot Act controls a lot more than we thought it did. The Patriot Act also made some pretty sensible changes after 9/11 too. I mean, there were some bureaucratic impediments to information sharing and cooperation among law enforcement and intelligence agencies that I think most people agreed needed to be remedied, and Patriot Act did that. But the more controversial provisions of it, now we find out that we don't even know how controversial they might be.
Yes, sir.
The Lincoln founder, Reid Hoffman, says that privacy is for old people. And I was wondering if you've seen any tendencies at all for increased thinking that privacy should have less priority and transparency more priority, so that people planning terrorist acts can't hide under the guise of privacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're pointing out is that privacy sort of is a double-edged sword, right? We all want our privacy, but we don't want the terrorists to have too much privacy. In terms of, if you're asking within government, I mean, how is it, are we focusing more on it or less? I think less. The comment about privacy is for old people. Well, the former Deputy Director of National Intelligence gave a speech 4 or 5 years ago, in which he basically said the same thing. He said that, look, we're kidding ourselves if we think our generation, and he was probably in his early 60s at the time, thinks that privacy means the same thing as it does to our kids and to a younger generation. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And while not as succinct as the guy from LinkedIn, he's essentially saying the same thing. I mean, no one from the government is going to come out and say we don't care about privacy, and I think they do care about it, but the goalposts have been moved. Do you know what I mean? There's something called reasonable expectation when it comes to privacy. I mean, when you're on the internet, on Facebook, what is your reasonable expectation of privacy? What is your reasonable expectation of privacy if you're driving your car? Can they put a GPS tracker on it? Supreme Court says they have to get a warrant to do that. What if it's a drone flying around your neighborhood taking pictures of people on the street? Maybe, maybe not. So all of these questions are debatable, and the government is always going to debate them, I think, in a way that comes down on the side of give us more power to collect information about you.
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you for coming. I want to ask you to go back to what you said about if the government got wind of another attack, that they would automatically go into, well, to paraphrase it, really, really big information gathering mode. Just before we came over here, I was watching CNN, and they were breaking a story about how over the weekend all the internet sources that the Al-Qaeda has used, all their networks, have gone dead. And now they are projecting what looks like a movie poster of the skyline of New York City that says, Al-Qaeda coming soon in New York. Would something like that trigger this mass collecting information mode?
Having not seen the report, I can't comment directly to it, but based on what you've said, it wouldn't trigger the kind of response I'm talking about. Where I think, what I'm talking about is that you would see just collection on people based on guilt by association, based on the most tangential of links. My suspicion, though, is that if, as you say, there's now on these various Al-Qaeda-related sites a picture of New York being shown, that who's really on top of that right now is the New York Police Department, which has an intelligence and surveillance capability that is arguably more sophisticated than the FBI's. Really, I mean, if you want to look at where surveillance has trickled down, if you like that term, from a federal job to a state and local job, go to New York. I mean, it's extraordinary, their capabilities. My guess is that that if this is happening right now, that there are conversations being had between CIA, the National Security Council, the chief of police in New York, and they're trying to trace whatever the source of that image is and figure out whether it's a hoax or not.
Yes, ma'am.
My question is, where do we go from here? Is there a way to protect us from terrorist activities and still maintain a way of life short of what to me was an invasion of privacy, the novel 1984. You probably not even read it, and that's changed tremendously. But the bottom line is, where do we go from here? What can we hope for?
Yeah, I think that two things. One is the debate needs to shift from where it's been over the past 25, 30 years, which is how do we create laws that control what the government can collect, and needs to be focused now more on what are they allowed to do with the information they collect. We've always been focused on what's called the acquisition part of the information, and with good reason. It used to be that the way you got information about somebody electronically was you went down to a phone switching station and put a pair of alligator clips on a copper wire and recorded their phone calls. Well, the digital revolution changed all of that. So I think now what we should recognize is that practically speaking, there are no real limits to the government acquiring whatever it wants to get. And yes, you can regulate that and put laws on it, but isn't the bigger question on what are they doing with it? The second thing I think is that where this debate is actually going to be playing out more profoundly, and where people should be watching for the contours that kind of take shape, is not so much on electronic surveillance, i.e. phone calls and those kinds of things, but what's going to be going on now in the name of cybersecurity. So there's legislation that's being debated on Capitol Hill right now that basically would start setting some ground rules for how much authority the government would have to require people who own and operate internet infrastructure to secure that infrastructure, securing your personal data, your financial data, securing systems that control things like power grids in the United States. All of this is connected to the internet. The internet is a conduit for data, and it is a backbone of controlling infrastructure in the United States. In order to secure that, the NSA and other agencies are going to have to monitor that network. And the law that's being debated right now is going to essentially set the rules on what they can collect, what they can do with the information. And it's my hope that sensible people are coming together to craft that legislation, but like sensible and coming together and legislation are not words that go together right now in Washington. There is some hope around that, though. I mean, there are very smart people from all sides that are weighing in on that bill and are trying to publicize as much as possible, as much as people are willing to listen, some of the more extraordinary measures that are in that bill, including one that keeps coming in and going out that, depending on how you read it, would give the president the authority in a national emergency to try and shut off the internet, which technologically seems impossible. But you see, like, this debate is happening now, and it's happening in that bill. And so cybersecurity is where I would look to what the future holds.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. What's your sense of how vulnerable the data that's being mined by the government is to being used for political purposes?
I think it's ultimately vulnerable to being used for any purposes. It depends on, what the conditions are of in the mindset, I guess, of the people using it. I will say that within the intelligence community, today, the people who sort of make up the ranks of management, if you like, who've been there for a long time, they grew up in the shadow of, Watergate and COINTELPRO and the political manipulation of information and going after war protesters and activists. And it was pretty well drilled into them that we don't monitor people for activity covered by the First Amendment. That's been pretty well drilled in. But what's come with that is, but there are a whole host of other things that we monitor them for. I think that they are much more interested in who is allied with Al-Qaeda than who is allied with an opposition political party. That said, I think it's important to understand that the apparatus that's being built is essentially agnostic. The technology is agnostic. It depends on who's in control and what the circumstances are and what the atmosphere is like. The computer just does what you tell it to do.
We have time for one more.
How does the United States compare to other countries?
Compared to other countries in terms of surveillance?
In terms of information collection and, I guess, manipulation or analyzation?
Well, the example people like to use in terms of a true surveillance society is the UK, where you have London covered in security cameras, although Manhattan is increasingly looking like that. But I would say that when it comes to collection, we're number one. We have the technological resources and the apparatuses from satellites and eavesdropping equipment and now drones to collect almost, limitless amounts of data. In fact, the NSA is collecting so much data that they are building basically a digital warehouse out in the deserts of Nevada right now to store it all. I mean, they're literally at Fort Meade, where the NSA headquarters are outside of Washington. Some years ago, they had an electricity shortage. They were collecting so much information that they couldn't power the computers to effectively to run them. I mean, there were little signs up in various offices saying things like, don't plug in the coffee maker, or if you do, unplug the copy machine, or things like this. I mean, the system was taxed because we're collecting so much. So I would say, in terms of our ability to sort of swallow up the network, we're number one.
Well, thank you so much for visiting us here at the Clinton School.
Thanks
Thank you all
all
for
very
coming
much.
out.
I really appreciate it.